Homer Davenport was an American writer and one of the highest paid political cartoonists in the world. In 1906, with the help of President Theodore Roosevelt, he, John Thompson, and Arthur Moore traveled to the Middle East to purchase desert-bred Arabian horses. With the assistance of Ahmet Hafez, a liaison between the Bedouin tribes and the Turkish officials, the three men were able to acquire 27 Arabian horses from the Bedouins in Syria. Of the 27 horses, 3 were not registered: Semri and the 2 horses belonging to Arthur Moore. There were also 4 in utero imports: Mohara and the 3 Haleb fillies, Seba out of Waduda, Salifi out of Urfa, and Maliki out of Hadba. Elements of Davenport Arabians appear in almost every major breeding program and straight Davenport programs today. The following is a complete representation and narration of Homer's documented personal experiences and observations of the procurement of the 27 Arabian horses that arrived in the United States in October 1906. There is no reference to a Bayan by name until he's used by Bradley and mentioned in a Hingham stock farm catalog. There are a couple of pictures of Thompson's Gray in the travel scrapbook that Thompson showed under saddle as Ali Bay. Davenport readers are at least 90% sure he's the horse that was registered as a Bayan. Abaya's head was considered by Bedouins the most perfect of the Anaze, with the greatest jebba or forehead Homer ever saw. She had been taken in war by the Anaze from the Shamar across the Euphrates, and her pedigree bore the last seal of Sheikh Faris, the great enemy of the Anaze, who had been dead 2 years. She was small, not more than 14 hands, 2 inches high. But Homer never saw such beautiful hindquarters and back tendons on anything in horseflesh. She was considered among the Anaze as their greatest race mare. Playing at Rashan's side was the baby colt Antar, foaled in June of that year. The colt was fat and husky and was chasing dogs. Homer bought Azra against the wishes of Ahmet Hafez. Azra bred on successfully in the United States and appears in Arabian horse pedigrees still today. Daer was a chestnut 2-year-old, which had been recently brought from Daer on the lower Euphrates. This little fellow was so full of life that they had to show him with all 4 feet hobbled, but he understood the hobbles so well that in his pacing motion he managed to make much play. Daer is the founder of one of the 2 sire lines within the Davenport breeding program. Euphrates, brother to Hamra. Ahmet Hafez considered his dam the best of her strain in the northern desert. Several attempts to purchase Urfa were made, and in the end, with the aid of soldiers, she was taken by force. Her purchase created quite a stir among the tribes. El Bulad was a stallion of rare beauty and conformation, showed great ability at the trot, and was a frictionless galloper. His dam was highly regarded as a war mare, and it required a great deal of persuasion by Ahmet Hafez for the Anaze to sell him. A brown mare with a filly not more than 15 days old at her side was shown to us. Hafez was especially anxious that I should see this filly, as it was sired by the horse I was riding, and was his double over again, without a single white hair and with the same peculiar head. She was a dainty little thing as she played around her mother, and Zahi's former owner followed them to Aleppo and then offered 65 pounds Turkish for the filly in Zahi, which was then 20 days old, but Homer decided to keep her. Farha stood over 15 hands high. Her eyes were large and very black, with brilliant highlights, but at the same time with a soft, kind look. The governor's son, Hikmet Bey, had been presented by the Gomusa tribe with another colt to take the place of the one which they had given to Homer. He was 2 years old, unshod, and stood a fraction over 15 hands high. He was the most powerfully made horse Homer had ever had the pleasure to see. His remarkable hips and shoulders were a sight. There was not a flaw in him. The Bedouins, when they came near him, all bowed. They thought he was a special creation of God because he had 3 black feet, the only white being on the left forefoot, which is a special mark of Allah. To cap the climax, the governor's son told Homer that as he had not yet made Homer a present, he would give Homer this colt. Hadba was a most showy animal with remarkable shoulders and hips and the most graceful neck and tail carriage. As the Bedouin owner galloped her here and there over the rocks to show her off, she was a beautiful sight. Achmet Hafez presented Hafia to Homer Davenport. Her sire was held in such high esteem that the Anaze refused to set a price for him for the Italian government in 1906. Haleb was 14 hands, 2 inches high, short-backed, with bone large and flat, shoulder of immense power and slant, and hocks long and well-formed. Over 200 mares were due to foal to him within a year between the Nejd and Aleppo. It was most unusual for a stallion used so widely at stud by the Bedouins to be exported from Arabia. This horse was fairly worshipped by the Bedouins of the Anaze. He was their pride. George Ford Morris, perhaps the foremost American equine artist, and who saw Haleb in 1907, wrote of him, "I have seen a great many horses, and the best horse of all breeds, and many strains of blood. I have never yet seen a horse that I could not fault, or would not wish to change if I had the making of him over, with one exception. That one exception is Haleb. He is small, which from the popular standpoint would be a fault. However, passing his size, upon the 2 occasions when I saw him, in his box and under the saddle, he filled my eye and satisfied my judgment, as no other horse ever has. He is a rich, seal-brown stallion, short in back, strong in loin, quarters as round as apples, and as beautiful as art could conceive them, strong in neck, of medium length, but superbly carried, and finished in crest and throttle, as though sculptured in marble. His head is small, clean, and sensible, not extreme in any way. His legs and way of standing on them, perfect." Hamra became the most influential stallion in the foundation period of America breeding through 1946. He sired 53 registered Arabian foals, and a total which was not surpassed until 33 years after the 1906 importation. He was especially noted as a broodmare sire. In his 1909 and 10 catalog, Davenport writes of him, "This young horse is rapidly rounding into one of the best of the entire importation. Hamra is a horse of immense power and finest possible action under the saddle and the gallop. He would impress you at once as a racehorse. His exhibit of flat, clean bone is indeed a rare one, and the peculiar oval of his loin is something unusual." Huron was used at Hinghamstock Farm and then by Hamilton Carhart, who bred him to the Huntington mare Nimnara to produce his only offspring still in pedigrees. Descendants of his daughters, Bent Nimnara and Huronman, bred to Raffles, produced Rafisa, Riffraff, Emmaraff, Raffi, Jita, Raffjita, Myjita, Riffles, and Raffareed. These horses can be found in almost every early major breeding program and modern-day pedigrees. Pictured with Haran is Saeed Abdullah, a Bedouin boy Ahmed Hafiz insisted Homer take to the United States to help care for the horses. Jeddah was the fastest walking mare Homer had ever seen. She was ridden into the desert by Ahmed Hafiz. She came originally from the Shamar and was later purchased by Homer and brought to America. She was a dark bay, 4 years old. Homer believed that in a walking contest with the best walkers that could be found in the country, she would be 5 miles ahead of them by night. Homer's group started for Sheikh Ali's tribe, the Aboughanis, a branch of the Anaze who seldom go far south in the desert. Sheikh Ali greeted them warmly and accompanied them on a 10-hour night ride to a Circassian village near the Euphrates, and bought the bay colt Kusaf, who had a peculiar dark brown spot on his right flank and was bred by the Anaze. Masoud was sold to C.E. Perkins in Iowa, who used him for crossbreeding on part-bred clay Arabs, an American strain of trotting horse during the 19th century. Although extinct, the clays did contribute to the creation of another American breed, the standard-bred trotting horse. Perkins referred to Masoud as the Bradley Arab, sounding as though he had no direct contact with Homer Davenport. Mawarda's dam, owned by the Anaze, was not for sale at any price, nor were her fillies permitted to leave the tribe's possession. Sadly, Mawarda has no descendants in Arabian horse breeding. Busan is the founder of the second sire line in the Davenport horses. He was alert and upright, with a high-set tail, large expressive eyes, and small-tipped ears. Busan descended from the listening horses. As the Bedouin legend states, there was a historic mare that stood listening, ignoring food given to her by the Bedouins. On that night, the most horrendous massacre in Bedouin history occurred, and that mare and only a few Bedouins escaped. Busan was much admired by President Theodore Roosevelt at the time the imported desert horses were presented for the president's inspection. In 1907, Busan was ridden by Buffalo Bill Cody during his Wild West show and created quite a sensation at Madison Square Garden. The first mare that was led into view was the flea-bitten, tall, and well-made gray mare Rashan, standing more than 15 hands high. She was much prized, as Homer had found out from the Anaze. 30 female camels had been offered for the repurchase of her. Homer approached Urfa, and true to the Bedouin custom, Urfa refused to let him come near. She bit at him and pretended to kick, and all this while, ragged Bedouins were patting her and patting her. But Homer, she watched like a hawk. As they departed, Urfa was a picture. She walked with the grace of a well-bred woman. Her tail would gracefully sway from side to side. Her ears were ever in motion, and her eyes sparkled. The very sight of her rested them from the long day's ride of the day before, and then she broke into a gallop, and her swinging tassels were soon lost sight of as she disappeared on the horizon. The gift from the Supreme Ruler was the chestnut war mare. She seemed to be fretting to get out of the only town she had ever been in. In her highly carried tail, Homer saw some blue beads tied gracefully in her hair. Her name was Waduda, meaning love. She was 7 years old and had been the favorite war mare of Hashim Bey for 4 years. She didn't like the town, and she wanted to go. Just as the big red sun was setting, they came to the desert. Waduda stopped, as if she was paying some tribute to the closing day. The faint roadway now seemed to disappear, and before them was a vast, barren plain. The sky was of a soft blue, tinted to gold by the sun which had just set. Homer turned in his Oregon-made saddle as easily as he could, that he might see where the rest of the caravan was. The mare did not notice his turning. With a quick and graceful toss of her head, she began to play. Homer sat down deep in his saddle and let her frolic uninterrupted. She finally stopped short and snorted twice. Turning slightly to the left, she started galloping with a delightful spring. It was the return home, the call of the wild life with its thrills of wars and races, with its beautiful open air as compared with the musty, stuffed corral she had been picketed in. She was getting away from civilization and back to the open. Once in a while, she stopped short, apparently to scent the rapidly cooling atmosphere. Now and then she pranced, picking her way between cane thistles. Her ears were alert, her eyes were blazing with an expression of intense satisfaction. Waduda had stopped short again and was scanning the horizon. Homer touched the mare with his heels, but she did not move. She was thinking. Of what? Who knows? Perhaps of her wars, or of combats on the desert, or of the keen edge of the Bedouin lance given when she had seen both horse and rider fall from the thrust of the spear of the great sheik who had ridden her. So for a long time they waited together in the gathering dusk, and as they waited, Homer had almost wished that they could always be alone. The call of the desert came strong to both of them. Waerdy is a very influential line founder. Besides the Krush Davenports, she's the dam line of the Tones Forseen daughter Saki, R.B. Fields' Ribald daughter Wardat Badia, and Jimmy Wrench's Cabria daughter Bent Badia. In 1893, the Hamidi Hippodrome Society had imported a number of Syrian desert-bred Arabian horses to exhibit at the Chicago World's Fair. After the fair, the horses were dispersed in the United States due to the lack of funds to return them to the Middle East. Peter Bradley, a wealthy industrialist, purchased several of the Hamidi horses and had them shipped to his Hinghamstock farm in Massachusetts. Bradley also got the lion's share of the Davenport importation as he helped fund Homer's quest to the Middle East. After Homer's death in 1912, his horses became the property of Hinghamstock Farm, and some of the other Davenports that were sold eventually found themselves at Hingham also. In late 1918 or early 1919, Peter Bradley sold a few horses to the Diamond Bar Ranch in California. The Hamidi mare Frida and the Davenport mare Salifi, two bays with minimal white markings, were among the group. Mitochondrial DNA testing shows the descendants registered to Frida matched the descendants of Urfa's Davenport daughters Rua and Sharia, and the descendants registered to Salifi are different and don't match anything else from Hingham or from the Diamond Bar Ranch. The hypothesis is that Frida and Salifi were switched when they traveled across the country to California, opening the closed Davenport group up to some elements of the following Hamidi horses.
I think the Hamidi horses are very acceptable in the Davenport program, and don't know why
I do too.
They weren't included.
The horses that Charles and I referred to as Siglares, we thought all traced to Urfa, and we were wrong, and we had trouble accepting that. Charles particularly had trouble accepting it, but sooner or later he did, and certainly I did too. I think that the evidence is there, and I think that the speculation about what happened is correct. So I have no problem with the horses that trace to Hamidi horses.
Jadon. $2 million to the Kellogg Foundation to restore what it looked like in the 20s. Big ranch in Indio with Lears.
How did they transport them? Did they have
Some by railroad. That's Ben Hur, the horse Albert Harris bred. And you should see Dyer.
This is Amham, a mare also that was the first prize winner of the Los Angeles National Horse Show, brought direct from the desert of Arabia. This is Antez, the champion Arabian stallion of the Los Angeles County Fair, 1928.
Second, Antez, an 8-year-old. Next, Hanad, a 7-year-old.
This beautiful gray was ridden by the late Rudolph Valentino in the photoplay The Son of the Sheep. This is Pep from the Davenport importations, and he's just as full of pep and vim and vigor as his name implies.
Now, I talked to a few people. We're not quite sure who this man is, but it may be Dr. Carl Kellogg. We're not positive, though. But with the glasses, it kind of indicates that that's who it probably is. Mr. Kellogg's house is up on the hill. You can see it in the left-hand corner of the screen at the top. And there'll be a picture first like Dr. Carl, and then the last person driving will be WK.
In the 1950s, Charles Craver realized that the Davenport bloodlines were in danger of dying out in their pure form, as they had been so extensively crossed with the Raffles bred horses. With the help of Alice Payne and Jimmy Wrench, he began to gather as many straight Davenports as he could. These horses, together with a select few that were found by Dr. Fred Mimick, Elizabeth Painter, and Reba Troxel, are called the Second Foundation horses. The Second Foundation horses and their descendants are all very closely related, but the Cravers, through judicious breeding choices, managed to establish different breeding groups within the Davenport herd, which have mitigated the impact of the inevitable inbreeding. That said, the horses are often very similar in type. They tend to have large eyes, fine skin, and high tail carriage, and are put together well with good movement prized. They are not very big, but neither are they small for an Arabian, averaging about 14 hands high.
One thing that you have going on with Davenport movement mode, where they're carrying a very, very upright neck, they do not move very well, and when those horses are trained successfully, that's not really the way they're trained either. The neck is brought into the position of a riding horse, and then they use their body more beautifully. It's true of any horse that if you stick its neck up too high, you will impair its action. You can stick its neck up too high with a bit, or sometimes the horse will just naturally carry its head up high. It's a beautiful halter horse, but that's not the mode in which he does his performance. Well, the Davenports are they're flesh and blood, and they're the same as other horses that we have here. And if they are exhibited in such a way that they can't move, they won't move. And part of training and part of turning the horse loose so that you can see what it is doing more naturally is letting the horse put its head in a position where it is naturally meant to move. And if you have a generation of horse people, which we have had from time to time in this country, surely not now, whose view of a horse is that its head is way up in the air, you will find typically that those horses, when they're in that position, are not going to move very well. And it doesn't matter what breed you have. Well, now if you happen to have horses in which bloodlines are very strongly oriented towards the horse that looks off in the distance and keeps his head up in the air, when the horse is in that mode, he's not going to move very pretty. And when Busan was sticking his head up in the air like that, when Hanad was sticking his head up in the air like that, I'm sure that was not the posture in which those horses exhibited their beautiful movement. I'm sure they had to be. But you just have to recognize the mechanics of the horse, that if you get the head sticking way up in the air like that, you can't turn your back. So you do have a beautiful moving horse. You have a horse with different abilities as to posture. And in certain postures, just like your car, in first gear it goes one way, and in high gear it goes another. And I think that some of the Davenports were particularly entranced when standing still, or getting their heads way up in the air. And if you take them out in the ring, and that's what they're doing, they're going to flip their feet out and do all sorts of fun things. Of it, I think one of the reasons for the reputation of movement of the Davenport horses is that quite a lot of them have had a very good adaptation to the human contact in the riding context, and they really train well. And it seems to me that their influence in pedigrees on outcross horses often is towards the performance type horse. And there seems, as a person with prejudice, which I certainly am, it seems to me that the influence of the Davenport in a pedigree is often to make the animal move its total body more. There's a type of movement which is very good and very much admired, in which the body stays still and the legs move. And I'm not knocking that, but it is a little bit different than the type of movement where the whole horse moves, where the body moves with the legs. And I think the Davenport influence is towards that latter type. And I can't think of any way to prove it.
My childhood was spent in Southern California. We lived in a little town called La Cañada, which is on the west side of the Arroyo Seco. Pasadena is on the east side. And during the Depression, my folks were always looking for the least expensive entertainment they could find, and they used to take us out to Kellogg's in Pomona, because Kellogg's had picnic benches set up on their property under the oak trees, and then they would offer a Sunday horse show. It had bleachers set up in a show ring where they gave us horse show. And so that was my introduction to Arabian horses, and I was fascinated right from the get-go. The next thing that happened was that my mother found at the Pasadena Public Library a copy of Roswan's book, Black Tents of Arabia, and brought that home to me. So that turned me on to Roswan. Anyway, my dad would take me, after the war, would take me to horse shows. And Southern California had a fairly active group of Arabian breeders who put on some of the first all-Arabian shows. And so we would go to them. And we would often also visit at the barns. And some of those wonderful people were just great to a kid. They were very encouraging and friendly to a kid. One of them was Alice Payne. Donna Jones was another. I'm blocking on some of the other names. Harvey Ellis. He was a veteran who had a horse, a mare named Monina, and he rode her without a bridle. And he used to do that. He used to demonstrate that at horse shows, but also he was a friend of Alice Payne's, and he would ride on her trail rides with his mare, Monina, and she was half Davenport. He bred her to Fursine and got Fernine, who was a pretty popular Fursine bred stallion back in that day. Anyway, that was a very important influence on me. The way how friendly those people were, and I was just, I'd fallen for Arabian horses by then. And it got into school, of course, and I couldn't have a horse while I was in high school or college, but went on through med school, and I was going to med school at Stanford, which is in the Bay Area. Went over to see Mrs. Draper, Edna Draper, who had Serene among other horses. And she also had a Davenport stallion whose name now I'm blocking on. But she was a very interesting and a very warm, friendly person. After I finished medical school and married and finished my psychiatric residency, we had our first child. We were visiting well, this was in Denver. By then I had moved to Denver. I moved here for my psychiatric education. This is where I met my wife, and we put down our roots here. But anyway, we were visiting Southern California, visiting my parents, when our first little boy was about a year old. And my dad and I went out to visit Alice Payne. And by then she was really concentrating on the Raffles line and on Raffles. She had at one time or another every bloodline, but she fell in love with Raffles really, and was inbreeding heavily to him. And she had an amazing herd of horses. They looked so uniform to me. She took my dad. I was off admiring Raff, I think it was, and she took my dad aside and said, "Do you think he's really serious? Do you think he's gonna get into owning Arabians himself?" And my dad said, "Yeah, I really think he will." And so she recommended to me. Well, she told me that she was offering to serious people. She would make an offer of that person taking a 3-year-old mare that was bred and in foal, and take the mare home, take care of her, see her through the foaling, and return her to Alice Payne, and then the foal would be this new breeder's. But she said, I think before you decide what you're going to do, you should go see the Davenport horses at Charles Craver's place. And by then, of course, I was familiar with Charles Craver's ads, and he was advertising in the Arabian Horse News, particularly some very nice photographs of Tripoli. And I was taken with him. And I was somewhat influenced by my dad, too. Dad was more of a thoroughbred man. His own father was a good horseman and took racehorses off the track. Well, they may not have done very well in racing, but he would acquire them and take them home and make them into ranch horses. And Dad liked a good-sized horse with a long swinging stride. That was very important to him. So he liked a little bit bigger horse. And he thought that Alice Payne's horses were beautiful, but he thought they were too small. Anyway, the next year, my wife and our children were visiting. By then we had 2. Were visiting her parents on the East Coast for Christmas. And on the way home, we stopped off to see Charles Craver. And it was a snowy, blustery, kind of a miserable day, actually. But he brought out his stallions and showed us everyone, and he brought out as many horses as he could show us. And I did like them. I liked them very much. And there was one mare that caught my eye, and that was Antan. Thought that she had a prettier head than the others, although there were many attractive heads there. But I was quite taken with Antan. And Charles' remark to me was, if you want a head like that, you need to go to the Gamil line. Gamil was Antan's dam. So I went back to the stud books and looked at that and found the name Mayday and Ibn Hanad. And I need to back up here, but when I visited Alice Payne, we discussed breeding stallions. What she considered to be a breeding stallion was a stallion who could produce as good as himself or better. And she gave me a list of 6 stallions. None of them she didn't include any of her own horses on that list. Well, one was Ibn Hanad, another was Tripoli, One was Serene, and one was a horse named Seneen, Seneyn, and she said he was of the Fursine line, and she didn't like Fursine, but she did like Seneen, and thought that he was able to produce an amazingly uniform group of horses. That he belonged to the Whitmores in Utah. And then I couldn't remember the other two of the six, and I corresponded further with Alice Bain, and she couldn't remember either. But anyway, it struck me that two of them were Davenports, Tripoli and Ibn Hanad. So I found the name of Mayday. Actually, she was one of four full siblings. One was Sunny Acres Darius, who was one of the breeding stallions for Margaret Shuey. Margaret Shuey made all of those matings herself. The Gabriel sons and daughters. Anyway, by some quirk in the Western Horseman, I subscribe to the Western Horseman as well as the Arabian Horse News. Back in the classified sections under horses, Mayday was listed for sale, and she was listed by name of all things. It was explained that she was a Davenport mare, and the owner was a man named Frank Brewster in southeastern Kansas. And I wrote to him and arranged to go see him. Actually, I was on active duty with the Army at that time and was living at the Fitzsimmons Army Hospital in the officers' quarters there. And we had another occasion to go to eastern Kansas, and so went on down to visit Mr. Brewster and saw Mayday, and she had at her side a filly that I thought was just exquisite. It had a very extreme head. Filly was sired by Ibn Fatal. Anyway, he wanted $3,000 for her, and I couldn't afford that, and so went home without a deal made. But he wrote me later and came down in price, and so I went ahead with the purchase. And I didn't have, I was hoping I could use the old stables on the Fitzsimmons campus, but couldn't get permission for that. So I didn't have a place to keep her, and I contacted Charles. And of course I wanted to breed her to Tripoli anyway. So Charles, the goodness of his heart, went down to Mr. Brewster's and picked up Mayday, and he persuaded me to buy a yearling filly named Ronnie, who was out of Mayday and sired by Tryon. I did buy her, and she was an outstanding filly. She was really quite flashy and beautiful mover. But she was chestnut with blaze and 4 white stockings. She was very eye-catching. Anyway, I did go ahead with that purchase, and Charles found a place for her with a farmer near him in Illinois. And that guy leased Ronnie to breed to his stallion. He had a general list stallion. That ended in tragedy. She died in childbirth with that foal. But anyway, we went ahead with Mayday, breeding her twice to Tripoli. Got Mayfa. First one was a filly, Mayfa for me. The next one was Moth for Charles. And then he offered me whatever horse. He suggested that I not breed her again to Tripoli, since we already had a great success in having 2 Tripoli daughters from her. And he suggested that I breed her to El Alamein, whom he had recently acquired from Canada. A beautiful horse. And the Otts, Jane and Kathleen Ott, contacted me and kind of pushed me to breed to El Alamein. And I don't know what got my back up, but I sort of felt like they were interfering. And I wasn't sure that I wanted to do that. And my wife was quite taken with Sir, remarkable and a pretty well-known stallion for Charles and for Alice Martin. Anyway, we ended up deciding on Sir rather than El Alamein. Although we got a nice colt, and Charles acquired him at one point and used him well on excellent mares, and he was a good producer and made a good contribution to the breed. But if we had bred to El Alamein, we could have produced, if we were successful anyway, we could have produced another non-Tripoli line. And that was why Charles wanted me to do it. I thought I was going to do that with Camille Ibn Salon, who I had acquired by then, that we would be producing a non-Tripoli line with him. But it would have been good to do both, and I feel like that's one of the mistakes that I made in my program. I wonder whether you knew, I think you probably did know, that the man from whom I got Camille Ibn Salon, his name is Robert Osborne, he used to go to horse shows with Jimmy Wrench, and Jimmy Wrench set up his breeding program. It was basically Wrench mares headed by a Davenport stallion. And the first stallion that Jimmy Wrench selected for them was a horse named Sherad, Sherad, who by blood was a full brother to Tripoli.
Okay.
But they were never able to get him to breed a mare. And the story was that he had been trailered with a mare that was in heat, and he tried to jump over the partition and turned over the trailer and was traumatized. And the story was that he wasn't afraid of trailers after that, he was afraid of mares. But I told Charles that story. He says, I'm not sure that's the real story. Sherad didn't work out, so Jimmy Wrench found Camille Ibn Salon for Mr. Osborne. And he used him, and if you look at Camille Ibn Salon's progeny, the first several were from Wrench mares, but that was at Robert Osborne's place. I have not emphasized enough the importance and the really overall joy of the relationship with Charles Craver. He was at one time in my opinion, the best horseman I had ever known. When I first got to know him, he was doing all the veterinary work on his, practically all the veterinary work on his horse, unless the horse really needed to go to a clinic. But the nearest vet to him was 60 miles away, and he did all kinds of veterinary procedures himself. And then when he had visitors like me, he would teach us how to do things, like how to pass a stomach tube and put oil into a horse's stomach, or he taught me how to do a Kaslick's procedure on a mare that needed to have her vulva sewed up, a so-called wind-sucking mare. And I did that on a couple of my own mares. He taught me to trim feet, and throughout my career, I trimmed my horses. I didn't shoe horses, so if I needed shoes for trail ride or something like that, I'd use a local farrier that I liked and trusted. But other than that, my horses had their feet trimmed by me, and I taught our oldest son to do that, and he helped out in my later years with the trimming of the feet. But Charles' enthusiasm for these horses was infectious, and his expertise was just amazing. I mean, he was capable of bringing a horse in training up to Grand Prix dressage level. Did that with Tybalt, a beautiful stallion Tybalt, and he did it with a couple of horses. The other thing about Charles was that if he was working with a horse like that, he did not let other people ride that horse. And once he got to the point where he was satisfied with going as far as he wanted to go with that particular horse, then he might let other people ride the horse, and then he didn't. But there were several horses that he let me ride that was a real pleasure. One, of course, was Tripley. I was able to ride Sir when Sir was still at Charles Place, and he also let me ride Aramis. And those two horses were amazing, but they were quite different to ride. Sir was light, very light. Felt like a feather when you were moving with him, but animated and had lovely gaits. Aramis was a powerhouse, and I had the most impressive extended trot. He was a wonderful, and that was a thrill to ride him. Another that Charles used to let people ride was Pericles, who was a quiet, sweet stallion that if you could put anybody on him and he'd be sensible and quiet, and didn't matter if there were mares on the other side of the fence, or he didn't mess with other things. He took care of his rider. But I did want to say more about Charles. He was a genius when it came to breeding and selecting matings, and particularly with an eye towards preserving as much genetic diversity as possible. Just really a leader in doing that, and in passing on to us other breeders the importance of doing that and how to go about it. But Charles also always had a passion for riding, and he was pleased that the typical Davenport horse carried good riding horse qualities, and Charles had an eye towards that, and also taught that. He was, I don't really know where he learned what he knew. He went to Culver Military Academy, which had the Black Watch troop, and he was a captain in that troop. But I don't think that those riders were high-level dressage riders. So where he learned that, I don't know. But he did train some of his horses to a very high level. And we had many conversations about that and about different individual horses and their capacities. And one time while I was working with Tybalt, he said, when you have a horse like this one, a day that you don't ride him is a day lost. And that stuck with me, because I didn't have horses quite as talented as Tybalt, but I felt that way about my horses too. Some of them I rode a lot. Camille and Salon, I rode pretty frequently during those years when I had him. And I also was inspired by Charles to try to start every horse I had. We didn't have very many horses, but I would try to get them started under saddle at least and get some sense of what their abilities were and what their potential might be. So I also asked him for permission to start the horses that he sent out to me. And one, of course, one of the early ones was Moth, full sister to Mayfa. We had Moth and Mayfa here at the same time for several years. And at that time, I was taking riding instruction from a European dressage master that we were lucky enough to have here in the Denver area. And I took Camille Ibn Salon to him, and he would give me instruction. So actually, both of us were being trained. And then this dressage master agreed to take both me and Barbara, and I rode Moth and Barbara rode Mayfa. So these green mares were getting trained at the same time Barbara and I were getting our lessons. Then later on, Charles sent Cathay out. Cathay was hired by Darenad and out of Orient, who was a Camille Ibn Salon daughter. He was a very substantial horse, a powerful horse, and I did start him under saddle. Just the very simple elementary working with him, but he was a powerhouse, and I thought he had wonderful potential to rival that of Tybalt and some of the others that Charles had. And I was hoping that Charles would continue with him when we returned Cathay to Craver Farms. But Charles didn't do that, and I was always disappointed. And I really think it was probably because I had started the horse. Charles didn't ride horses that other people rode, because he figured that his cues would be different from whoever it was. But that was a disappointment. However, Charles was a great example of appreciating the horses. We talked at length about movement and the quality of movement and athleticism of the Davenport horses.
Yeah, so my name is Philip Bienvenu. I have 3 Davenport horses, 2 mares and a stallion. And you asked me to talk about Shada as a present-day Davenport owner. And I can say that all 3 of my horses descend from Shada, so she is back in their pedigrees. She is present in the Davenport herd we have today through her son, Camille Ibn Salon. And I have him in my pedigrees, and I have one of actually only 4 stallions, I believe, that carry his sire line, which is the only sire line to Antez in the present-day Davenports. Let's see. I was really happy to see that film that Lonnie found of Shada with her foal by Cabria. It showed her to have been a pretty well-made mare, and what I particularly liked, and it was nice the way it came through in that film, was how shiny her coat was. We do get some shiny coats on the Davenports. Not all of them as obviously shiny as hers must have been, but we do get some beautifully shiny coats, but it's nice to see that. She was a very interesting mare, looked kind of different. I thought that she she was a good representative of what I would call Arabian type, and the Arabian strain is one of the bottom lines that came off the desert. Davenport had at least 4 horses on that strain. One was the stallion Dare, also a stallion named Arabian, and then he had a mare named Abaya and her daughter Hafia, and they were all of the Arabian strain. It's a fairly distinctive type, I think, although there's disagreement even among Davenport breeders about what the strains are really good for and stand for, and whether you really can see family resemblances, but I think you can. And I think that strain type came through Shada to Kamil ibn Salan, and from him I think it shows up sometimes in his descendants. So what I would say about her pedigree that actually reinforces that Arabian type is that her sire, Sanad, S-A-N-A-D, who also, by the way, is only represented in the present Davenport herd through her line. I think he had a number of foals in his day, but the Davenport of today only carry him through that line to Kamil ibn Salan and Shada. What I see in his pedigree is a really reinforced version of the same kind of Arabian type that might have come through Antez. Antez was a more famous stallion from the time, and if you compare Antez's pedigree with Sanad's pedigree, you see exactly the same components rearranged and maybe reinforced in Sanad. There's more line breeding in his pedigree than there is in Antez. But anyway, he shows a fairly strong Arabian type in his pedigree. It's to be expected, and I think it comes through. Shada's dam is important to us because it's another line we have. She was actually a full sister to the mare Gamil. Gamil, Gamil, was a mare at Mishui's Sunny Acres farm that gave birth to Ibn Haned, who was a fairly famous stallion in his time. Mayday, who was, I think, her first foal, sired by her son. And Mayday was a foundation mare for Dr. Fred Mimak in Denver, who acquired Kamil ibn Salan and made him available to the Davenport mares that were around in the 60s and 70s, I guess. So it's because of Fred Mimak that both Mayday's line and Kamil ibn Salan's descendants are part of the herd today. Gamil was a fairly famous, highly considered mare in her time. So it's nice to have another line to her to her sister. What I'm thinking is, I'm not sure I've ever seen a picture of Sheba, but I have seen pictures of Sanad. I even saw a reference to him once that claimed he was over 15 hands tall, which seems surprising to me. I tend to think of the Davenports as having 15 hands as an outside limit, but I guess he might have been.
And I guess we're up to RJ's talk. So, any questions or thoughts or comments while we take a quick break?
We'll start with this mare, which was actually the first mare that Homer Davenport acquired when he made his 1906 trip to Aleppo on the desert outside of Aleppo in quest of Arabian horses. And this mare was presented to him along with the young man seated on the ground. And they came to America with their 26 other horses that were in the Davenport importation. And they arrived here at a time, I think if you count them up, The other important horses that had arrived here up to that time in 1906 that went on to have lines in Arabian breeding. The Davenport importation, I can't remember the exact, in one boatload that had arrived up to that point. And it became really an important element in American Arabian pedigrees, and was crossed with the crowd lines and practically everything else that's ever been here as well. This mare was probably raised in an environment such as we're not used to seeing horses raised in, and lived a life such as we're not used to seeing horses that have lived a life like that. And she's sort of in her pictures comes across as kind of a bony, awkward-looking mare. And yet, if you look at her descendants, I think they probably tell you more what she really was than her own pictures do. And if you look at the descendants and then go back to this picture of her, you can see, well, that trait is present there. And you can see that in a different horse it's expressed a little differently. There is a certain type of really dynamic, magnetic chestnut stallion that breeds on from this mare. And probably the first example of it was her son, Hamwad. And he's not a very famous horse. He was bred at the Hingham Stock Farm way before there was Arabian horse magazines or Arabian horse shows. And he was exported to Cuba. Was never used to stud in this country. But he's very closely related. He's by Hamran out of Waduda, so he's very closely related to a couple of the stallions from the Waduda line that ended up at the Kellogg Ranch. And he shows some of the same traits and qualities and features that they had. He had a full sister named Malaya, who is really, in some ways, fairly similar to him in expression. She's a feminine version. And she's quite a key mare in modern straight Davenport breeding, but she's also everywhere in American Arabian pedigrees at large, and CMK pedigrees, her various offspring. And I wonder if the Hingham Stock Farm, they didn't know that they had something really special in this mare, because of all the Hamra daughters, that was the one they took back to him. This horse, Hanad, who was a sire at the Kellogg Ranch, and then went to Texas, and then Alice Payne went out there and rescued him and brought him to California, and he had yet another suitor in California. There are things about this horse that I think very definitely come from Waduda, and he would not be the horse he is if he didn't have her in his pedigree. And whatever came together in this horse really breeds on fairly strongly in a package from him, including the balanced three-circle conformation and the upright carriage of his neck. This is Hanad, H-A-N-A-D. And these, like a lot of these early Davenport horses, is very important, at least the ones we're going to look at here, very important in modern straight Davenport breeding and also in CMK pedigrees at large. This is his very close relative, Antez, rather than being a grandson of Malaya, he's a son. And again, I think he shows quite a bit that comes from Waduda. You can see traits that come from his sire as well. But like Hanad, he would not be the stallion he is if he didn't have Waduda in his pedigree. Antez was a sire at the Kellogg Ranch, and then for General Dickinson at Traveler's Rest. Then he was exported to Poland and sired some foals there. Then he came back to the U.S. and had more foals born here. I think he lived up until 1921, up until 1944. I believe he was kicked by a mare, had to be put down. This is a daughter of Antez in the background there named Shylin. She is midwifing this foaling here. And Charles might be able to tell you a little more about it, but the mares from the Mayday line at Traver Farms, Mayday was double to Shilan, have a tendency, if there's a mare that's going to pull out the pasture, why they're just right there. And that is something that apparently is carried down genetically. I mean, the Mayday mares do, and so it's obviously something genetic. And here's an ancestor there who's doing the same thing. Now this is a horse foaled in 1971. Michael and I were looking at a grandson of his in Colorado that really looks quite a lot like him. And Michael said, well, that's Antez. And I said, well, no, I thought the Golden Chestnuts were Antez. And Michael said, well, Antez also does this. And I thought about it, and he's right. This is a horse named Ahmed Hafez, who's bred at Craver Farms, and is through his son Plantagenet, prominent in the more modern Davenport breeding. And this is his son Plantagenet. And I think there's a lot of Waduda and Antez and Malaya, that whole line that can be seen in this horse. Now we'll go back to another horse that was in the Davenport importation that's also had a strong influence on what his descendants look like. And this is a horse named Busan. Was acquired in the Damascus phase of the Davenport expedition. And he is known for passing on an alert character and tiny tipped-in ears, among other things, in his genetic package. It's another picture of Busan. And he was part of the problem with the Davenport importation, and a lot of the early breeding. The Davenport importation included 17 stallions and only 10 mares. Well, it's kind of hard to give all those stallions an equal play at stud when your ratio is like that. And he sired a number of foals, but he's really only in pedigrees through one of them. And that's his son Leitan. Leitan went out to California and was used as a ranch horse in the 1920s, working cattle, and then ended up at Kellogg Ranch, and sired foals in both places. And something about the eye and the ear, the sort of compact gray horse, a lot of vitality and verve, breeds on through Leitan. So really, rather than talk about the Musan influence, you get Musan just through this one line, so it's really the Leitan line, because he obviously, like Michael said, he had two parents, and so he picked up some things from his dam as well. This is another picture of Leitan, and it's to illustrate, the reason I chose it, illustrates the prominent eye cages that this horse had passed on, which is another trait. They're just set very prominent, they're just set way out on the side of the face. And it's something that breeds on very strongly. Also, you can see the fineness of the lower face and muzzle to an extent. And watch how the eye cages are passed on from Leitan to his son, Dareb. Now this horse is out of Malaya, who was the dam of, we were looking at earlier, it was the dam of Antez and grand dam of Handed. So she comes in again, and when he's bred to the Antez and Handed lines, you're doubling Malaya quite a lot, doubling and tripling her as the generations move along. This is a horse that's really passed on a lot of Leitan character. And there's another picture of him here. Note the ears again. There's a story I was discussing with Charles Craver this morning. I read in a magazine, so it's in print, about Alice Payne, about how somebody said, well, they used to sit up in the stands at horse shows with Alice Payne, and they'd sit up there with all the stud books and look up each horse as it came into the ring. Well, that was a much easier proposition then, because today you probably need a couple of rolling library cards to have all those stud books along with you. But the story goes that a horse would come in the ring and Alice would look at it and she'd say, well, it has Musan ears. And they'd look up the pedigree, and so many generations back, well, there he'd be. And Charles said, well, he always heard Alice Payne refer to that as, rather than Busan years, Leytan years, and mentioned that she credited it to Thelma Dean.
Who's the person in that?
I believe that is Florence McConnell, who owned him from the time he was about 7-year-old stallion right up until he died when he was 31, and absolutely adored him. And the McConnells did some very important, at least in modern Davenport breeding, matings with this horse, a Davenport mare named Antera, who was Nantes' daughter. He's also in pedigrees. They had a mare named Nasa, who was by the Fred Kellogg's by the crabbed stallion Piranha, and out of Antera. And he's in quite a few pedigrees through that line as well, scattered through the breed.
He also started Farnham.
Oh, that's an important point. A foundation mare for Donald Jones was sired by this horse named Farnham. And Donald Jones was a very influential breeder in California, starting when, in the 1930s? I think he was already going by the 1930s. In fact, Donald Jones, I think, was one of the first 3 people who had an Arabian judging card. Bill Munson told me it was him and Donald Jones and one other person. Zareb had a couple of 2 sons and 2 daughters that were important as the modern straight Davenport breeding program developed. This is his daughter, Durana, who shows a Leytan character and also some of the features from her tail female line. And then she had a full sister named Deriva, who shows that stamp of horse again. Deriva has a son named Sir, who has the ears and the large eye, and partly the large eye is coming from Rishan, but he has the prominent eye cages and the ears and the muzzle and lower face. A lot of that is Leytan character. This is not such a great slide. This is Sir's son Lysander, a sire at Craver Farms. Another horse showing that influence, more modern Davenport horse, is Brimstone. Brimstone is sired by Durantes, who is a full brother to Deriva and Durana. He's the sire of one horse anyway that we're going to see today. This is another picture of Brimstone. This slide's a little dark. This horse actually has just one cross to Leytan, and it's many generations back. This is a horse named Brigantine, and he's the sire of another stallion we're going to see today. He is by Tripoli, and out of a Tripoli daughter named Portia. Yeah, there's just the one cross and several generations back, but that package has come on down. Although there are other things going on in this horse as well. He is probably not as typical an example as maybe Sir was. Now, that's too dark to see. But this was included, this is Ibn al-Amayn, and this was included to show that there are other things that just kind of pop out. Probably in horse breeding at large, but this is an example of it happening in the Davenport breeding group, where they're really, this horse is kind of a different type of horse. And you can see how he's related to his ancestors, and yet he's something kind of different that's come along, and he's it's bred on from him. And as the pedigrees get more homogenized, it'll be interesting to see if other things turn up like that. They might or might not. But this is a horse named Ibn al-Amayn.
His sire was another of those four full difference that you talked about.
It would probably be possible to do an entire seminar on Arabian horses and how they move. I think Charles brought up an important point that we did see yesterday. Some really nice moving horses, and some of them had Davenport elements in their pedigrees. Some of them had only tiny Davenport elements, and some of them
got to know the straight Davenport horses, associated Davenport horses with horses that didn't move well, because we grew up breeding Gladys Brown Edwards. And I think we need to speak to that. My first exposure to a straight Davenport horse was watching a Brigantine move. And I almost passed out. I couldn't believe how this horse moved. I was so impressed. And I turned to Frank Hennischlager, who had him at the time, and I said, this is not the kind of movement that Gladys Brown Edwards wrote about. But I think you have to look at the history of the Kellogg Ranch, that H. Reese came to the ranch with a background in Morgan horses and hackneys. And when Charles Smith got to the ranch, and they were training those horses in a certain way. And you look at those old pictures, even old Lantez had long feet. They were weighting these horses. My theory, and it's only a theory, is that the Davenport horses adapted the least to this kind of artificial method, this kind of shoeing, this kind of riding. And so were probably discarded for that reason, because they could look the least like the saddlebreds and the Morgans and the hackneys. And so I think that's important. But now that we've come back and a lot of us are more interested in a horse that moves his whole body, and we're finding that these horses move great, and I think consistently they do.
I think one of the ones to Naomi. And we like the horses real well. This little mare would be a better mare than she looks.
She was about an abortion.
Yeah.
She couldn't stand when she was born. I liked her a mess.
Great.
We're lucky she was able to stand.
But no matter
I'm
how
above
many
them, so she
generations
looks
of
smaller.
Davenport you pile into these horses, they retain the character of the other part too. And we think it's one of the wonderful features that you don't lose good breeding by just overwhelming it. And
this mare is beginning to push 90% Davenport. Turning to 15.